Now we've seen how the expando object works and how we can arbitrarily add properties and methods to an object, and when someone accesses one of those properties or methods using the dot operator, the runtime will just be able to find it and get a value or invoke a method. Now I want to show you how to do the same thing but with DynamicObject. DynamicObject is much more powerful than expando because there's all sorts of overrides that you can do inside of the object to completely influence how it's going to behave at runtime. The way I'd like to demonstrate the dynamic objects is to take the same code that we had before that was using an expando object and implement it without the expando, use a dynamic object instead. So we're not going to use the asExpando extension method. Instead, I'm going to have a dynamically typed variable called doc. And what I want to do is create a new class, because the way that you use this dynamic object in .NET is to derive a class from the dynamic object base class. So let's say we create a class called DynamicXML that's going to inherit from DynamicObject. We will still pass it in a string that represents the file name it's supposed to load, but then the rest of the code I want it to remain the same. When someone says doc.employees, I want it to respond dynamically by looking up employees and handing back a new dynamic XML instance. And when someone says employee.firstname, it dynamically looks up that value so that we can write out the first name. So let's create this class. And as I mentioned, I want this to derive from DynamicObject. The constructor parameter here is actually going to be a file name, and behind the scenes we can still use xdocument and link to XML to parse this XML. So I can say load this file name that was passed into us, and let's create a private field to hold that XML. So I'll create a field, and this I also want to be a dynamic object. At this point, we've done everything so that we should be able to build and compile successfully, so we are syntactically correct. But let's see what happens when we try to do doc.employees. I'm going to run the application, and we'll have an exception. So the runtime binder exception says that essentially we went to look for this employees member, and we didn't find it, so we're throwing an exception. With the expando object, we had all of those properties pre-programmed into the object. We read through the XML and put everything into an expando object. The dynamic object, we take a slightly different approach, and that is to override one of the many methods that are available to respond to runtime behaviors and runtime requests. In particular, the method that I'm looking for is the try_get_member method. This method will be invoked when someone walks up to this object and says, hey, give me .employees or do .speak. What the runtime will do is put together some binder information about what it's looking for, and then it's up to this method to either look that up and return a result, or just set result to null and return false, which would indicate, no, I'm sorry, we didn't find that. And one of the pieces of information that you'll get in the binder is the name of the member that the runtime is trying to get to. So when someone says DynamicObject.employees, then binder.name should be equal to employees. And I can use that. Let's walk up to the XML that we have loaded and use link to XML, the element operator, to try to find an element that's a member with that name. Then it should be able to return me something. And let's put that in a variable called XML, and we can check if we got anything. If XML is not equal to null, then we have found an XML element by that name. And so what we can do is assign that to the result, and what I want is another instance of dynamic XML so that we can continue this dynamic behavior. And at this point we can return true. If we didn't find anything, what we'll have to say is result equals null and return false. And typically what will happen then is the runtime will throw an exception because the code was looking for something that wasn't there. Now this operation right here is going to require a slightly different constructor than the one we have, because the constructor we have expects a file name. Now what I really want to do is just take an existing XML element and wrap it with this dynamic XML class. So let me create another constructor. This one takes a dynamic XML object, And what we can do is just assign that to the field that we have in this class, and now we've wrapped that bit of XML. Let's do a build. And this time, what we should find is that we've gotten an additional step further. This time we were able to give back the runtime something when it asked for .employees, but now apparently we've reached that for each loop where we're trying to loop through all the employees and print out the first name. Because what the runtime is trying to do now is trying to convert a dynamic XML object into an IEnumerable, something it can loop through, and it's saying, sorry, we're not able to do that. But this is easy enough to fix. We can just make dynamic XML enumerable. So I can say, please be, and please implement the IEnumerable interface. The IEnumerable interface that I wanted to implement is the one that is from system.collections. So not the generic one, just the IEnumerable that's in system.collections. That makes us implement a member. That member is called getEnumerator. And what we can do here, we can say, well, if someone's trying to loop through this dynamic XML object, then they must want all of the child elements that are part of the current XML node we're on. So let's go ahead and write a for each loop that will go through each child element that is inside of our XML element. And so this time I'll use the link to XML elements operator to get all of the children. And then for each of the children that we find, we will again create a new instance of dynamic XML to wrap that child object and return it to the outside world. Let's do a build and try this application one more time because we're getting pretty close, but there's one more problem. You can see that what we're printing out is just the name of the type, dynamic XML. If we go up here to the application and think about why this is happening, it's because when we say employee.firstname, now what we should be successfully doing is when we say employee.firstname, it will invoke that tryGetMember method. So employee.firstname will come into tryGetMember, say I'm looking for something called first name, we'll find that element, and we'll return it as dynamic XML. What we really want at this point is for first name to be a string. We want the value there, but tryGetMember doesn't quite know that. However, there's another trick that we can do here. What console.writeLine will try to do when it comes up to an object is it will try to convert this into a string. And if we just provide an operator that allows a dynamic XML object to be converted into a string, everything will work just fine. So let's create an implicit operator that will convert a dynamic XML instance into a string. And again, this is something that is really easy. We'll look at the private XML field that is in that parameter. We're allowed to do that because we're inside of the same class. And we'll just use the value property on that to say, hey, give me back the value that is inside of you. So build one more time. Run this application, and now we're actually getting the names out. So to summarize what we've seen here, DynamicObject can be a bit more work, but there's truly a lot of power in being able to respond dynamically to something that the runtime is requesting from you. Being able to execute logic to figure out what is the programmer trying to get to, what is the runtime asking for. That's a lot more powerful and flexible than what ExpandoObject gives us. And the end result again is that we have a nice API here for reading and parsing XML files.